After exchanging farewells and leaving Baroness Corlin's manor, Ludmilla and her lady's maid walked over to visit Countess Jesn, whose residence was a short distance away. Her butler promptly answered the door, a silver-haired man with a distinguished air who had served House Jesn for as long as she could remember. He led them into the building, guiding them to the courtyard where Violette Jesn was seated in the shade of a magnolia tree. Ludmilla waited at the edge of the open space. "Lady Zaradnik," the butler announced in a clear and dignified voice, "Baroness of Wardensvale." "You just told me that a minute ago," Countess Jesn snapped. "What is it?" Ludmilla nearly faltered as the words jabbed at her while she stepped into the courtyard, curtsying before the aged matron of House Jesn. She didn't think she could ever harden her mental defenses against the ornery old woman. "Good afternoon, Lady Jesn," she said. "I hope I find you well." "I'd be well if not for all these blasted books." She tapped a gnarled finger on a familiar-looking tome on the table set out before her seat. "Whoever wrote these damn things doesn't care a lick for the elderly. I'll have gone blind before I finish getting through all of them." Ludmilla tilted her head to read the spine of one of the books. It was one of the almanacs provided by the administration. "You have been to the civil office, my lady?" she asked. "Oh yes. A line of those dried-up undead ogled me all the way to the front desk. I went to ask for a few things and ended up with a pile of this garbage instead," Countess Jesn huffed. "Familiarize myself with the proper procedures," they said. "What tripe?" Despite her verbal hostility towards the new system, it seemed that she was doing just that. Ludmilla spotted a pile of forms neatly filled out on the stone bench beside the Countess. "Did something happen, my lady?" Ludmilla was curious what had driven her to action. Why the sudden rush? "Moment happened," the aged matron replied. "According to the couriers that started appearing yesterday, that troublemaker popped up in my territory and started wandering around, riling everyone up. Now a man appears every few hours from one or another of my vassals, begging for directions. Everything's a mess. Irantel is still asleep and my entire domain is screaming for goods so they can keep working." It seemed that the adamantite adventurer was now starting to work the strange magic that she had seen take effect in Corlin village and other territories as well. Having her territory come back to life all at once had the Countess working at a frenzied pace, trying to deal with the supply bottleneck it had caused. "Is this happening everywhere?" Ludmilla asked. "Is Merman more than one person?" Violette Jesn returned in a snide tone. "Ask a silly question, get a silly answer." Ludmilla decided to deliver her message from Forgemaster Mesmet so the Countess could continue with her work uninterrupted. "I stopped by to deliver a request from the Eastern Quarter, my lady," Ludmilla said politely. "Their stores of charcoal are running low." "Tell me something that I don't know," Countess Jesn rolled her eyes. "It's obvious that if I don't send fuel for over a month, they'll run out, yes? Well, I'm sure they will be relieved that you're on top of things." "On top of things? Ha!" Ludmilla paid her respects once more before leaving the Countess to her duties. They departed again, returning to the manor to ride the wagon out of the central district. They arrived at the Merchant Guild a couple of hours past noon. This time, there was a young woman in the uniform of the Merchant Guild working at the reception counter. Her hand slammed down onto a stack of papers that had begun to flutter from the breath of wind that accompanied their opening the doors. She startled herself with the noise she had made and looked up. Rather than beautiful, her face would be more accurately described as handsome, framed in well-defined features that belied her timid reaction. She attempted to blow a loose curl of blonde hair falling over her face out of the way several times before finally giving up and brushing it away with her hand. "Welcome to the guild, Baroness Zaradnik." The woman bowed, and the curl fell over her face again. "You know who I am?" "Of course," she said brightly. "I recognized you the moment you stepped into the building. Or maybe I felt it? Anyways, you're exactly as the guildmaster described, even your clothing is the same." "Oops." The clerk's hand came up to cover her mouth. Ludmilla placed the bill from Mesmet's forge on the counter along with her account book. As the woman looked down to scan the invoice, Ludmilla looked around the office. "The man I dealt with a few days ago was the guildmaster?" "Oh yes, that was him," the clerk replied as she turned to make her way into the office. "Never missed a day of work as far as I can remember. He's up in the archives right now doing something. I'll be right back." The way she spoke was reminiscent of the old man's clipped tone. Ludmilla fished up her stamp before the woman returned. The clerk placed her account book on the counter over several additional documents she had come back with. Your account balance has been updated, Baroness Saradnik. These are the applicants that came forward and expressed an interest in your offer of tenancy. Their addresses are also included. Is there anything else the guild can assist you with, my lady? I didn't get your name. Oh. Apologies, my lady. The clerk dipped her head. Edwina Hoffman. Darian Hoffman is my grandfather. The guildmaster, I mean. I see. Well, give the guildmaster my regards, Edwina. Yes, of course, my lady. The receptionist bowed at her desk again as Ludmilla turned to leave. Thank you for your patronage. Stepping down the stairs of the Merchant Guild, Ludmilla looked over the still empty main plaza of the city. Her eyes were eventually drawn to the cathedral on the opposite end. She had not visited the last time she was in the city, so she thought she should before she returned to Warden's Vale. She wasn't sure how the undead Soul Eater would react to the cathedral, or the cathedral staff to the undead, so she had it parked a distance away and walked the remainder of the way with Amelia. The building was old, it had stood for well over a century, but careful maintenance by the temple staff left it in good condition. Though it was massive, there were no ornate frescoes or fixtures adorning the exterior. Stained glass windows alternated in the colors representing the 6 great gods. The entrance to the cathedral was framed with 2 pillars supporting an overhang that shaded the open doors. A light scent of incense filled the air as they entered the vestibule, and a figure standing in the aisles further inside looked to the shadows silhouetted by the light from the entrance. Ludmilla immediately recognized the man walking up to them and curtsied as he approached. I hope the day finds you well, Bishop Austin. She lowered her head respectfully, and Amelia followed suit. Ludmilla felt a light touch on her head, and a familiar wave of warmth washed over her. Blessings of the 6 be upon you, child. The man's gentle voice was just as warm as the magic that he had bestowed on her. He smiled just as warmly as she raised her head. Ludmilla Zaradnik, he said. You are much taller than you were last year. Any taller and I will be scaring away prospective consorts, Your Excellency, she replied sardonically. Consorts? The bishop's face fell. So your entire family? His voice trailed off and he performed a ritual gesture and prayer for the fallen. May the merciful Sursana grant them peace. I am so sorry for your loss, Ludmilla. He leaned forward to embrace her. After a long moment, he pulled away, but his hands remained to grasp her shoulders lightly. He examined her teary eyes before speaking again. The times are troubling, but in such times we must hold to faith and do what we can for one another. Is there anything I can do to help you, Baroness? I would ask the same, Ludmilla replied as she wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, but there are several things that I must report to you first. Bishop Austin released his hold on her shoulders and motioned from them to follow him. He led them to his office, which was through a door in the hall running along the side of the building. When they were seated at his carefully organized desk, he leaned forward to hear what she had to say. When we received news of what had happened, Ludmilla said, Priest Bohadan recommended that we evacuate to the theocracy. It seemed prudent with what we could make out from the details. A reasonable course of action, he agreed with a slow nod, especially considering what information must have made it out there. It is a short distance from your domain to the border of the theocracy. What was your decision? I agreed with him, she replied. I waited as long as I thought was safe, just in case, but in the end I placed the villagers under Bohadan's care. And you stayed behind. Austin finished for her with a tight smile. I may not have lived as long as the venerable Bohadan, but I know your family well. House Zaradnik has a valiant reputation, which has gotten quite a few members of your family into all sorts of trouble in generations past. I suppose it is inevitable that you would choose to face your challenges as well. Do you think I made the right choice, Your Excellency? Bishop Austin leaned back from the desk and rose to his feet. He walked over to another part of the office, lined with large wooden bookshelves that Ludmilla understood were filled with the registries of the families that were supplicants of the temple. He returned with one such registry, which bore the crest of House Zaradnik, opening it in one hand and slowly flipping through the pages. The look on his face suggested that it was not his first time going over the contents. His expression was that of reminiscence, not study. You are the scion of a bloodline blessed with both strength and resilience, Ludmilla, the bishop said. While this strength may wax and wane over the generations, I should let you know that several men and women from your line have risen to greatness in the past." Ludmilla tried to hide her confusion. As far as she knew, the only member of House Saradnik who fit the description was its founder, Andrei Saradnik, who was an adamantite-ranked adventurer. Bishop Austin did not miss her struggling with her expression. "Most came from the time before Andrei Saradnik settled in Riastais," he explained. "A few came after, descendants of the family that married off or went to seek their own fortunes and started their own families elsewhere, just as he had. What is even more important, I believe, is how true the members of your family stay to your heritage. No matter how strong or weak, they all display the same stubborn and noble fortitude that has become a hallmark of your house." The bishop closed the book and placed it on the desk. After hearing his words, Ludmilla had become extremely curious about the contents of her family register, as what Austin shared with her suggested that the theocracy knew more about her lineage than her own family had. He still had more to say, however. "My superiors would probably say that your bloodline is too precious to lose in this realm that has fallen under the rule of an inhuman sovereign. They may demand that I somehow safely get you to the theocracy so that they can help it grow further and flourish under their auspices. But, personally, I believe that you are precisely where you need to be, for what is the purpose of cultivating the strength of humanity, if not to be employed in its hour of need? It is exactly because Erantel is in this situation that those of your caliber have the opportunity to shine as an inspiration to the people. Momen might have stayed behind to do just this, but he is ultimately only an adventurer. You, however, are a noble with all of the influence and authority that comes with your place in society, and it is the nobles that are in the position to do the most for the humans of this realm. There will be no victory born from strength here, nothing that raw might can achieve. Humanity needs its heroes, but the heroes that we need here now are the ones that will ensure that our place in this land remains secure. So yes, I think your decision to stay was the right choice." The bishop's words were reassuring, yet they placed a burden on Ludmilla's shoulders that she did not feel qualified or capable of carrying. She was barely getting started with her own domain, never mind turning into whatever he envisioned for her future. "What about the temple, then?" she asked. "The doors were open. Does that mean that you plan on staying, even with the city being ruled by the undead?" "The presence or absence of the undead is not what determines whether there is a need for the temple. We serve humanity. As long as there are humans here, so shall we be here for them. Our doors will always be open, even when our children go astray." Besides, the corner of his mouth turned up in a half-smile, Riastais has always been a secular nation. The temples here have long learned to work without the privileges enjoyed by those in the theocracy. While they have not directly approached us for any reason, it is said that the Sorceress Kingdom has adopted the laws of Riastais, so the role that the temples fill should mostly be unchanged. The ones that have forsaken Allah Alaf and Sursana may have a harder time coming to terms with the state of the realm, but we, at least, do not ignorantly turn our faces from the aspects of the world that all humans must face. Ludmilla considered the bishop's words. His patient and nurturing disposition was what she was accustomed to, as the priests which served the realm were charged with the well-being and growth of the people. It was what she had based her initial optimism on, how the faith of the Six might stand to gain from the transition of power to the Sorcerer's Kingdom, and it seemed that the bishop held something of the same outlook as well. It stood in stark contrast to the vehement accusation spit out at her by the subdued scripture member. She supposed the difference might lie in the roles that they played. A priest serving a city or village would, by necessity, approach things differently than a warrior whose purpose was far on the other end of the spectrum. As House Saradnik was sworn not to reveal the existence of the scriptures or their work, she could not even confer with the bishop even if she suspected he may know of their movements as well. "I apologize for my thoughtless words, Your Excellency," Ludmilla said. "I should have known better." "It is an understandable worry." Austin leaned back into his seat. "I imagine many of the citizens would have the same fears." "About that, has there been any word about my people in the theocracy?" Ludmilla asked. "Since I know that their homes are safe now, I would like for them to return. I can fund the supplies that they need for the journey back, if that is an issue." "I have not heard anything from my superiors since their statement of neutrality months ago," Bishop Austin answered. "I believe communication will return again when the fears have blown over and trade between nations resumes. I will include your query in my updates on the state of Erantel when they can be sent on their way." I see, Ludmilla said. In that case, I will have a lot of homes available in my domain for the foreseeable future. If anyone expresses an interest in settling the frontier, please let me know and I will arrange for their immigration. Of course, Baroness, how shall I send word? The Crown has made the guest manors freely available to the nobles in an effort to help us better acclimate to the changes following the annexation. You may leave a message with my staff there. Very well, Austin nodded. Your kind offer of tenancy to the people is a reassuring thing. Thank you, Baroness. The Temple of the Six. The faith of the six great gods of the slain theocracy, or all of humanity, as their staunchest adherents would have one believe, is a powerful institution steeped in centuries of venerable tradition. With the legacy and bloodlines of their deities firmly within their grasp, agents of their faith are accustomed to dealing from positions of power and authority. Caretakers of their race, they guard humanity against any and all that stand to threaten it, their agendas enforced far and wide through the strength of arms and magic provided by the elite forces cultivated through a long program of international eugenics, which has produced many of the most powerful individuals in the history of the human race. Their institutions and temples are an ubiquitous sight across the realms of humanity. They play a central role in all aspects of life. Or so they had meant for this reality to be so. Shortly after the defeat of the demon gods, the theocracy embarked on a great venture to seed the lands wiped clean of undesirable elements with settlers of their own choosing. With one foot firmly planted in the doctrines of the faith and the other in the blessing and support of their fatherland, these humans spread far and wide to the hopeful expectations of the theocracy, who interspersed many strong bloodlines amongst them. Not long after, however, the fruit that they had expected to be born through their efforts turned sour. The intricate web of their influence frayed as distance and time wore away at the bonds between the ancient nation and the nascent human states subject to its influence. Apostasy eventually became so rampant that a schism manifested, resulting in the majority of the population worshipping only four of the six in the northern nations of Roblé and Riestais. The latter established a secular government, but half of its territory broke away shortly after its founding to give rise to the Baharuth Empire, which retained this political separation from the temples. Though their operations were adversely affected beyond the borders of the slain theocracy, the scattered temples of the six great gods remained even as the practice of their faith diminished. The approach they established in order to uphold their sacred charge over the human nations diverged greatly in some aspects from the zealous practices of their home country. They still continue to strive to become a pillar of support for humanity, but the populations that they serve care little for their zeal and their rulers suffer no challenges to their authority. As the temples are an administrative organ in addition to a religious one, the work of the priesthood extends not only matters of faith, but also the careful monitoring of the myriad of bloodlines and cultural practices founded through their influence. Fortunately, a few important aspects have remained. Though not explicitly belligerent, human-centric thinking is still prevalent in every one of these nations and the practice of monogamy is still widely promoted, making the tracing of valuable lineages easier to achieve. Though outwardly perceived as places of worship, every cathedral, temple and shrine is also an office, a part of the vast network of faithful administrators that helps to manage the future of humanity and ensure its survival in a world of savage and powerful enemies. Bishop Austin accompanied them as they made their way out of the cathedral, the trio stopping at the top of the short set of stairs in front of the door. His gaze followed a patrol of Death Knights crossing the far end of the plaza, their plated footfalls clearly heard all the way from where they stood. Ludmilla's attention was directed to their left, however, to look at one of the nearby buildings. "What has the Adventurer Guild been doing since the annexation?" she asked. The bishop turned his attention away from the undead to follow her gaze to the nearby guild hall. "As far as I have seen, not a whole lot," Bishop Austin told her. "While they have not closed their doors, there are only a few parties of adventurers going back and forth. It is nothing at all like what it used to be. The Magician Guild appears to be open as well, but the wood golems that they used to guard the place are gone. I suspect that they have long since transported all of their valuables away to other branches. According to one of our clerics that paid a visit recently, the Adventurer Guild is in a similar situation. She said that, since the formal transfer of the duchy to the Sorcerer King, new requests have ceased entirely and most of the old ones are gone as well. The source of most of their work is at a standstill, though," Ludmilla said. The nobility has not exactly been in the position to commission new requests or fund bounties for our territories in the past few weeks, and merchant operations are nearly non-existent. That may be so, he replied, but just having a glimpse of the Sorcerer King's forces, I have no doubt that the vast majority of what adventurers normally deal with will no longer be an issue. It has become like the theocracy, in that sense. They absorbed their local adventurer guild branches into the ranks of their forces long ago. Ludmilla's discourse with Lady Shiltir in the past few days suggested that this might be the case for the Sorceress Kingdom, but she still was not sure of the exact details on how national security was handled now. There were requests for military assistance available to be submitted at the civil office, but surely there were a few things that adventurers would be more suitable for over the undead. The single-minded and uncommunicative attitudes of the Death Knights and Elder Liches stationed everywhere made it unlikely that they would be ideal for situations that required an unconventional or indirect approach, or one that saw benefit from a human touch. I am sure there are still things that they can do, Ludmilla ventured. The nobles occasionally hire adventurers for entertainment, or as diplomatic couriers and escorts. Merchants commission them to find rare or difficult-to-obtain resources and various other things that employ their unique skill sets. I suppose, Bishop Hostine said. It would require that the adventurers actually have those specific skill sets, however. The majority are essentially combat specialists. Ludmilla frowned. There was no easy way around the problem for most. She very much would have liked the Adventurer Guild to continue existing in the city, as House Zaratnik had a long relationship with the organization. That was not something she could do much about though. She had her hands full seeing to her own matters. Turning to say her farewells to Bishop Ostine, she returned to where her wagon was awaiting them near the main street crossing the plaza. Taking her seat, she flipped through the addresses she needed to visit as Amelia settled in beside her. Her maid had been something of a shadow during the entire visit, ever ready to come to her mistress' assistance but never a distraction while she spoke with the bishop. Ludmilla's fingers stopped as she flipped to the page with the strange farmer. Lutzi, she asked, did the others say anything about this weird farmer? Mrs. Rowe did not say anything, my lady, Amelia replied, but the Lynham sisters said he was creepy. That was not helpful at all. All it did was make Ludmilla more apprehensive about meeting him. Looking over the addresses again, she realized that she had no idea where anything was in the city. It was actually Lady Shiltir and the Soul-Eater that had done all of the navigation when they had spent the day together wandering around the city. She held out the sheets in front of herself and her maid. Which one of these is closest? Ludmilla asked her. After glancing over the papers, Amelia pointed to the nearest address. It was the farmer, of course. With a sigh, she relayed the address to the Soul-Eater, and it drove the wagon to its destination. The building they stopped in front of seemed normal enough. It was a narrow structure of 4 stories, with sun-bleached wooden stairs running up the side. She thought about having the Death Knight follow her up to the 3rd floor where the man resided, but the massive, armored figure would probably scare the residents witless as it stumped up and down the stairs. They made their way up and lightly knocked on the door. She heard movement inside and, after a few seconds, it opened by a sliver and a short man with a pale face looked up at her questioningly. Morin Boar? Ludmilla kept her voice even. Yes? His voice did not seem strange at all. The more she thought about his description as being creepy, however, the more she tried to find abnormal things about his rather normal appearance. You expressed interest in the offer of tenancy over in Warden's Vale? Oh, yes. His voice picked up slightly, and the doorway opened fully. There was really nothing at all strange about the man. He was short and a bit pale, but could have appeared anywhere and not looked out of place. Are we leaving now? He asked, seeming uncertain on how to address her. It struck Ludmilla how odd the fact was for a noble to be personally going around the city picking up new tenants. Migration was usually organized by the temples, guilds or the city offices. Even in those cases, they would simply receive permission to immigrate and head off on their own. She supposed that it couldn't be helped with Erantle in its current state, but at some point she wouldn't be able to afford the time to see to such things. We will be leaving before the evening, Ludmilla said, so you have some time to prepare. There is a gazebo near the royal villa in the central district, that is where we will be gathering. Gathering? Morin's brow furrowed. It should be plenty of time, I'll be there. With that, he softly closed the door. Ludmilla felt the entire build-up of tension leading up to their meeting a colossal waste of energy. What was creepy about him anyways? After returning to the wagon, she turned to her maid. "I didn't see anything wrong with him, did you?" "No, my lady," Amelia shook her head. "He was quite rude to you, though. My apologies for not setting him straight, I was too caught up in the whole thing about him." "No harm done, I think," Ludmilla said. "I doubt he realized who he was speaking to, not that I could blame him for not expecting a noble to come straight to his door." With the potentially problematic farmer turning out to be rather normal, Ludmilla felt that she could get through the remainder in short order. The next 3 stops were all woodcutters with young families. Each had a roughly similar set of circumstances. While the sorceress kingdom was supplying provisions to the people, the air of uncertainty still weighed heavily upon them. With the industries inside the city mostly at a standstill, even those that were willing could not find employment, so they had chosen to leave rather than continue to face an unknown future. They all shared the same look of relief on their faces when Ludmilla explained why she had come to see them and were issued the same instructions that she had left with Morinbor. The smith was all the way out in the military district, which was originally built as a staging area for the royal army of Reistais during conflicts with the empire. Outside of these periods, most of it lay empty aside from those who had good reason to be there, usually some business involving the cemetery that occupied the entire western quarter of the district. As they approached the address, they saw a middle-aged man, with streaks of grey through his barely kept brown hair, sitting on a tree stump tinkering with something. A strange sort of cart was parked nearby, and he looked up at the sound of the approaching wagon. Seeing the Soul Eater headed his way, he stood up and backed away warily. Ludmilla stepped down off of the wagon and made her way across the trampled grass. The location indicated by the address was actually a mustering field for training levied men. The soil was rough and uneven, and she could see the imprints of feet in the dried ground where men once stood to practice for their upcoming skirmish. As she came nearer to him, she noticed a small tent pitched near the side of the field, under the shade of a nearby building. "Ostrike Kovarev?" Ludmilla read the name written on his form. "That's me." His words came slowly, and his wary stance remained unchanged. "You responded to the call for a smith in Warden's Vale?" "That's right." He straightened his posture, put his work aside and pulled a cloth from his coveralls to wipe his hands. Ludmilla wondered if there was some unwritten law that required all smiths to be gruff and short-spoken. She looked over the area around him again. Beyond the tent and the cart, he had dug a fire pit and a clothesline was strung between 2 poles that had formerly propped up practice targets. Several articles of clothing were being hung out to dry in the afternoon sun. "Transportation will be available in the central district late this afternoon," she told him. "Do you have a family you need to gather before you leave?" "Course not," he grunted. "A traveling smithy isn't something you'd want to drag a family around with." Though people who traveled to various locales to perform their trade existed, Ludmilla had never heard of a smith that actively traveled before. It would certainly explain his accommodations and, by its appearance, she guessed that the strange cart was actually some sort of compact forge. "If you are a traveling smith," she said, "then what are you doing here? The city has plenty of forges." "I followed the royal army into Irantal during the winter," Ostrike explained, "that many men coming in at once and the city gets swamped with work, so my skills are at a premium. Plenty to be made doing even simple things like making horseshoes, nails and fixing odds and ends. Been at it since the Empire started the whole staring contest years ago." "But, you can perform the work of a regular smith, yes?" Of course," he said offhandedly. "This whole setup might not make me look it, but I am a master smith. The guild won't lie to you about that." "Is it better to be a traveling smith than it would be running your own forge in a city somewhere?" Ludmilla asked. "Depends," he answered. "Maybe if I was up north in Bloomrush's territory working mithril, but then I wouldn't get to travel. I made most of my coin doing work for the army for a few months, then I wandered about as I pleased for the rest of the year. Plenty to see and learn by watching how other different masters work in different places. It might not be the most stable thing, but I'm happy with what I gained by doing it." "So why didn't you just leave Irantal after what happened?" "Lost everything in the rout." The smith made a sour expression. "Well, nearly everything. There was no warning, not enough to tie everything down, at any rate, only a wave of panicked men that bowled everything over. The press of bodies just swept me away from where I set up shop. When I finally got back, most of everything was gone. As scared as they looked, some bastards weren't so scared that they wouldn't stop and ransack whatever was in the way. Emptied my tent and flattened it. My horses disappeared too. Only reason why the forge was probably left behind is because it's too damn heavy for a guy to run off with. That sounds terrible. Oh, it was terrible. Then this will be a temporary arrangement then? Ludmilla asked. Once you get back on your feet, you will return to your travels? Nah, he said bitterly. Losing years of your livelihood kind of takes the shine out of an adventure like this. I figured I would just work under some lord somewhere and that'd be it. Saw the posting at the Merchant Guild and thought, why not? Well, if it is any consolation, Ludmilla said, I would gladly have you at Warden's Vale. I thought I would need to wait much longer before my domain grew large enough to attract a master smith. Your domain? He frowned. Sorry, my lady, I've never seen a noble running around like this before. Figured you for a higher up in the Lord's retinue. I had just the same thought when I started doing this today. Ludmilla accepted his apology in good humor. I do not plan on making it a regular thing, but if something needs to be done, then it needs to be done. Fair enough, Ostrich said as he started to take down the clothesline. Better than one of those high lords that can't even be asked to tie their own shoes. Pardon the language. Do you have a way to move the forge? I don't see a way to hitch it to your wagon. How much does it weigh? It's mostly empty of fuel and ore, so around 300 kilograms. It's already packed up, so if you have a way. The iron gang plows that the Death Knights could carry were a bit less than double the weight of the forge, but, since it was on a wheeled cart, she figured that a single Death Knight could easily pull it along. She motioned to her footman. You shouldn't have any problems transporting that, yes? She asked her footman. It stomped forward, sheathing its flambeau. Lifting the tongue of the cart with its free hand, the Death Knight pulled it free of the shallow rut that secured it. After pulling the forge along for a few meters, it looked to Ludmilla and nodded. She mused over how expressive it seemed. Maybe it was just restless from doing nothing but following the wagon around all day. Ostrich shook his head from where he was watching near the tent. Who needs a damn horse when you have legendary terrors working for you? He muttered. Are you from the Sorceress Kingdom, my lady? I am formerly a noble of Riestais, Ludmilla replied. My title is a part of the duchy, so I went with it. Well, you sure got used to things real quick. Everyone else is still hiding under their beds. It's not as bad as it seems, not anymore, anyways, Ludmilla told him. The territories are already getting back to work, so the city will soon follow. In the meantime, I intend on pressing every advantage I have. All of my tenants will use the undead for simple labor, if there is a place for them in their professions. You're kidding, Ostrich looked at the Death Knight. You mean this guy'll work for me now? No, that's one of my footmen. I've requested a few skeletons that will work for you. I've seen people using elementals for work, he said, but undead would be sure to have the neighbors reporting you to the authorities. Well, I'm not sure what I can do with some skeletons, but I guess we'll just have to see. I'll need a few minutes here to finish packing up, if you don't mind. Ostrich turned away and continued to put away his belongings while Ludmilla returned to the wagon with Amelia. It wasn't long before the smith tossed his bags over the side of the vehicle and pulled himself onto the back. They picked up one of the woodcutters and his family that they came across walking through the city on the way to the central district, dropping them all off at the gardens near the gazebo. Her new tenants gaped wordlessly at the hundreds of undead arranged on the road nearby. Ludmilla looked around until she spotted a cluster of 4 skeletons standing apart from the others. Lutzi, she said, pointing them out, take those 4 and bring them to Mrs. Roach. The staff in the city will practice directing them and evaluate their usefulness while we are away. Yes, my lady. Amelia stepped off of the wagon, and the new tenants gathered nearby watched wide-eyed as the maid took command of the skeletons and led them to the side, awaiting Ludmilla. We are done here, thank you, Ludmilla said to the Soul Eater. You may return now. They made their way back to the manor as the wagon rumbled away, giving Tara a shock with her new undead assistants. After Amelia instructed Tara and the Lynham sisters on how to control the undead laborers, Ludmilla spoke. I expect you to be well versed in working with the undead by the time I return, she told them. Any new hires should be instructed on their use as well. All of the tenants had gathered by the time Ludmilla returned to the gardens from the manor. Nearly all were still gathered a distance away from the formations of undead laborers. She walked up to stand in front of them and their eyes turned to her. There were 16 in total, the smith and the farmer, the 3 woodcutters with their wives and children. As you may have noticed, Ludmilla addressed them, Warden's Vale will have plenty of the undead around. The offer you responded to should have said as much, but, if you are having second thoughts, you may withdraw. I have no need for tenants who cannot adapt to life on the frontier and embrace the new ways of the sorceress kingdom. She wondered what she would do if they all just turned around and left. Fortunately, after a few minutes, none of them did. Their focus turned away from her, however, as Lady Shaltir arrived and riveted all of their gazes to her enthralling beauty. Ludmilla came forward to pay her respects to her liege. I hope the evening finds you well, Lady Shaltir, she greeted her. Are you all set here? Lady Shaltir asked. We are all assembled, my lady, Ludmilla nodded. This should have the domain well on its way. Good. Maybe Albedo will finally stop trying to have us join her in her boredom with some numbers to crunch. Lady Shaltir walked a short distance to the gazebo and opened gate. The column of undead lined up and marched in. When the last Death Knight pulled the portable forge through, Ludmilla motioned for her new tenants to enter. Ostrike stopped just before the gate before leaping through for some reason. The others similarly stopped to stare at the black portal hanging before them before hesitantly stepping into its threshold. Is there any limit to this magic, my lady? Ludmilla asked as the last of the villagers filtered through. It drains my mana as long as it continues to be used, Lady Shaltir yawned as the long procession finally ended. Just this much is not a problem, though. There are also ways to extend the duration with some assistance. Do we even need roads if we can always rely on this magic? Ludmilla wondered. It's certainly useful if you need to deliver something or transport large groups quickly, Lady Shaltir told her, but it's not necessary for transporting regular cargo. A warehouse or port can only accommodate a certain amount of traffic at any given time. It doesn't matter if it reaches that capacity through a constant stream of wagons or ships, or through magical transportation. In that sense, it's an inefficient use of mana, and a liability should I require that mana for something else. I see. You are quite knowledgeable about these things, my lady. I suppose that's why I'm the Minister of Transportation. I would still like for His Majesty to find more for me to do, though. Lady Shaltir looked to the western wall, where the sun was beginning to dip below the massive barrier. It's about time for yet another meeting. You should get going. Thank you once again for your kindness, my lady. Ludmilla curtsied deeply. I hope to repay your favor soon. Like I said, all you need to do is... Lady Shaltir's voice cut off. A moment passed before she spoke again. Work hard and produce results that will help me gain the regard of His Majesty. Her liege's words carried a hint of ambition that had not been there before, and Ludmilla rose with a bright smile. Of course, my lady, she said. I am at your service. After stepping foot on the sandy flats below the entrance to the village, Ludmilla looked around as the gate closed behind her. The undead had arranged themselves neatly once again while the villagers stood together on the path between the village and the pier. Nonna floated down from the west, and the new migrants shifted away as one. How are things out on the fields? Ludmilla asked as the elder lich settled down in front of her. The work continues, Nonna replied. Inventories for spare tools have fallen by 15%. Ludmilla winced. How are we losing so many tools? She asked. I don't recall losses like this from previous seasons. Your statement appears to reflect the data collected from Carney, Nonna nodded. I have come up with several theories as to why this is. We can discuss them when we're out there tomorrow, Ludmilla told him. I need to make sure the tenants are settled before evening falls. We have a smith now to help with repairs, but we need a long-term solution that doesn't constantly tie up skilled labor. I'll need him for other things soon enough. I concur, Nonna nodded. Delays and resources consumed by substandard equipment produces suboptimal results. Do you have any ideas offhand? Since a smith is present, the elder lich stated, the option of upgrading the equipment may be possible. Orichalcum or adamantite should suffice. Behind them somewhere, Ostrike made a choking sound. That's a joke, right? Ludmilla asked. Nonna did not provide an answer. How much would a single adamantite shovel even cost? Was there even enough in the duchy for all of that equipment? Definitely not. Have there been any more accidents out in the fields? No. Any new incidents in the village? No. Any sign of trespassers? No. Ludmilla made a face. She knew it was just the way that Nonna was, but she still preferred a more verbose rapport with her subordinates. One more thing before you get back to your work, Ludmilla motioned for the elder Lich to accompany her as she walked over the new arrivals. This is Nonna, Ludmilla said to the villagers after they had turned their attention to Nonna, or rather, they wouldn't stop staring at her. If you have any issues with the undead, please let her know. The line of faces all paled in unison when they heard her words. I meant issues you encounter as you work with the undead, Ludmilla reiterated quickly. Any surprising news as well. Nonna is evaluating their work around the fief. What you learn here will be used all around the duchy, so it's something of importance to the entire sorcerer's kingdom. The villagers relaxed somewhat after she waved the Nonna away. She led the group up the road and into the settlement. You may choose any of the homes here to settle in with your families. Miss Lutzi here has cleaned most of them up. Ludmilla looked towards Amelia, who nodded. There is a shrine at the top of the hill to offer your devotions and prayers. Conveniences such as magical faucets do not currently exist here, so water is drawn from the river. If you feel that you are ready, Miss Lutzi can also teach you how to direct the skeleton laborers to help you with various things. Shares of food for the week will be distributed once you've all moved in. As they dispersed, Ludmilla called out to the farmer. Moranbor. Yes, Baroness? You'll be moving into the hamlet out in the fields tomorrow morning, so don't get too attached here. By myself, my lady? He asked. There will be nearly 600 undead laborers around you as well, Ludmilla told him. I hope you don't mind. Of course, my lady. That the short, pale man had so smoothly accepted her words was the first thing Ludmilla noted was odd. She couldn't imagine a regular farm tenant being able to accept such an arrangement so quickly. She watched him as he disappeared into a home nearby, but she did not notice anything amiss. Ostrich appeared from the home furthest to the west and walked back down towards her. That was quick, Ludmilla noted as he approached. I'm used to it, he said. Wanted to set things up while the light was still good. They walked back down to where the portable forge was parked on the flats. She issued orders to the new undead farming teams and watched them march away before turning back to the smith. Do you know where you want to place your forge? Yeah, Ostrich replied. Below the place I moved into. The wind comes in from the north, so working there won't blow fumes over the village. Appreciative of such a consideration, Ludmilla called the Death Knight pulling the portable forge over to follow them, as well as 4 skeletons. The smith went ahead of them, continuing to speak as they walked. This is quite the place you got here, Lady Zaradnik. He kept looking around at their surroundings. Most of the duchy is farmlands and forests. I didn't expect a beautiful place nestled at the base of the mountains like this. Wouldn't mind finding a wife and settling down here. Warden's Vale was chosen for its natural beauty, she replied. Plus it's defensible. We don't have much else though. I've seen a lot of places, the smith told her. This territory is very nicely balanced. As long as you have people here, you'll be set. They stopped at the westernmost point of the lowest village terrace, overlooking the fork in the road which branched west into the fields across the wooden bridge. Ludmilla crossed her arms against the wind as she watched Ostrich unpack his forge. Opening the locks, he lifted the hood which covered the cart. The steel wagon was divided into 2 sections. One side opened and was pulled out to create a small extension, where he unpacked and placed the 2 bellows to point into an opening to the other side. The other section appeared to be an enclosed furnace with a bed for fuel and a window which faced them. There was a wood stump, which he rolled out and placed his anvil on. Lastly, he pulled his tools out from inside the furnace with a series of metal hooks, which he hung on the edge of the forge to arrange his equipment on. I've never seen something like this before, Ludmilla said as Ostrich drove pegs into the ground that were attached to chains securing the forge. What can you do? Any sort of smaller-scale metalworking, the smith said as he circled his forge. I can even repair armor and make weapons using this. I'll be getting things ready to build a real smithy on this part of the terrace here when there isn't any work to do. Could make a few things if you need 'em as well, but first I need to start some mounds for charcoal and put together a bloomery. You have materials for everything right here in this valley, so all we need is time and labor, which you seem to have plenty of with all these undead here. If I can figure them out, that is. Won't you need iron ore? Ludmilla asked. Ostrich looked up from his inspection and peered at her strangely. Was there a smith here before? Not that I know of. Then you probably have plenty of ore to work with for now. Ludmilla frowned in confusion. Seeing this, Ostrich continued speaking. I'll show you after I'm done here, he said. Need to get together with the woodcutters first if we're going to get started. He returned to his work and seemed to have nothing else to say, so Ludmilla turned back to walk down the lane. She looked up and saw several villagers moving about and, as she turned to follow the path up to the next terrace, she came across Amelia. Her maid was followed by the village women, as well as 3 girls. My lady, she nodded. The maid and those following her were all carrying several empty buckets each. We were just headed down to draw water from the river. There are a few of the men waiting at the warehouse for you. The group continued down the way, stopping in front of the remaining undead that had not been deployed to the fields. Amelia spoke at length, during which several of the women backed away, but, when she finished, the children immediately dashed forward. They handed out their buckets to the awaiting skeletons and led them off towards the riverbank. Seeing this, the adults hesitantly came forward and led away their own. Ludmilla wondered whether the girls had been thrilled at the prospect of having the tiresome work handled by the undead, or maybe it was the idea that they now had underlings to order around. She initially thought that it would take days for her to convince anyone to start employing the skeletons, but it seemed that the children were far more flexible than their parents. The men of the village were waiting in front of the warehouse, accompanied by their sons. They stopped speaking between themselves as they noticed her approach, turning to bow awkwardly. All settled? Ludmilla asked. Yes. Thank you, Lady Zaradnik. The men exchanged glances before one of them spoke. The construction of this village is different, but the homes are clean and warm and there is plenty of room to expand. When we were gathered in the city, I thought all those undead you brought would be everywhere, but I can barely see any of them. It's better than the city. Those huge, armored monsters are everywhere, standing guard and constantly patrolling the streets. This place has more than its fair share of death knights, she explained as she unlocked the warehouse. All of the undead will be put to work here, several of them will be assigned to assist you and yours as well. Is that safe, my lady? He spoke tentatively. The Unda. You may consider the undead to be your fellow laborers here, Ludmilla told them. As was said earlier, I intend for you to become pioneers in what is surely a new reality for everyone here. The same reality that the entire duchy will eventually need to face. You had best become used to it, and apply yourselves well. Your wives and daughters are already discovering how convenient they are. I doubt you will be able to part them from their newfound helpers once they have. As if on cue, the line of bucket-wielding skeletons came up the lane with the group that had come down a short while before, disappearing into their respective homes. Ludmilla entered the warehouse and began to distribute supplies to the villagers. There was only enough for Amelia and herself for the remainder of the season, which would only last a week between all the new immigrants. She had no worries about the apparent lack of supply, however, the natural abundance around them would amply feed her people with plenty to spare until more regular sources of food were established. The men returned to their homes with their provisions and Ludmilla entered the warehouse again, stretching as she looked around the nearly empty building. Her gaze eventually fell to the corner where she had placed Jeeves' box. It, too, had disappeared as if it had been inextricably connected to the existence of the undead butler. She felt a pang as she continued to stare at the empty corner. He had been so upbeat about his future duties and then his existence had been callously extinguished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. A shadow fell across the doorway and Ludmilla looked up. Nonna had returned, taking her place beside where Jeeves' box once rested. The warehouse had become a base of operations of sorts for the elder lich, and the tome she always carried opened in her withered hand. The scratching of pen on paper went on as she jotted down notes in a strange language that Ludmilla had never seen before. She assumed it was the information that Nonna had been sent to collect and assess in her tireless quest for efficiency. "Do you miss Jeeves at all?" Ludmilla asked the elder lich. The sound of writing continued. Nonna did not care to answer. Ludmilla pressed on however, determined to find out once and for all how the undead felt about the loss of one of their own. He was undead as well, wasn't he? Ludmilla said. He was so happy with his work here. Don't you think what happened was terrible? Nonna's pen continued across the paper, but her voice rose up to answer Ludmilla's question as the Elder Lich continued her work. There are fates that are worse than the one that he met. There are worse fates than death. What could be worse than death? Ludmilla scowled a bit. As long as you continue to exist, you have the future to look forward to and new experiences and opportunities will inevitably present themselves. The Elder Lich stopped writing and looked up at her. Nonna's glowing crimson gaze examined Ludmilla as they stood across from one another in the shadows of the warehouse. To be abandoned by your masters, Nonna finally said. Left without explanation or even a single word. You will never know why they left, or where they even went, and you will never see them again. Only left to wonder why. Was it something you did? Did they tire of you? Were you inadequate in some way? You will stand alone, without guidance or purpose, as you watch the endless eons ebb and flow until, even as you have pondered these same thoughts for an eternity, existence itself crumbles into dust. Ludmilla stood aghast at Nonna's words. It was an incomprehensible fate, yet the words twisted into her soul like an icy blade, spreading cold tendrils of helpless despair throughout her being. There are worse fates than death, Nonna repeated herself. Jeeves met his end in the service of his master. It is an enviable thing,